You like physically can't use solar, wind, and batteries to decarbonize and then take on those difficult to decarbonize. I think if as a country and as a world, we have to take on the heavy polluters. We can't just keep skipping it over and saying, look how well we're doing with EVs and look how well we're doing with home solar. We have to look at the refineries. We have to look at the cement factories, the glass factories. Like we have to tackle those and decarbonize them.
Welcome to the Intergenius Podcast with Joe Patch IV.
I want to welcome everyone to another episode of the Intergenius Podcast. I'm very excited to have my guest today, Mike Hopkins. Mike was the former CEO at Bakken Energy, and right now he is the chief advisor and the legal team leader over at Plus Power. Mike, great to have you on today. Thank you for making the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Joe. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's kick it off right from the beginning. One of the things we like to kind of start the show with is kind of get a little background. I think it's always something our audience likes to kind of get a beat on, kind of where'd you come from? How did you get to where you are? And oftentimes it's not a straight path. So if you could give us a little background on kind of how you got to where you are today to kind of kick it off.
Be happy to, and definitely not a straight path. So I am Canadian originally, born in Canada, the child of a father who was a chaplain in the Canadian military. So constantly moving around. Including overseas as I was growing up. Great experience for both me and my sister. One observation is sometimes it is a great experience, sometimes it isn't. It really depends on the person, whether you're into that idea of a constantly changing environment, or you just need stability, which you just don't get growing up in a military family. But that's where I began at a very, very early age, like kindergarten, inexplicably. I became infatuated with the idea of being a lawyer, for sure, before I knew what a lawyer was. But
really, wow.
Yeah, the backstory to that is I was attending my father's church chapel as a chaplain, and I saw in his church James Bond, a guy who looked like Sean Connery, the then, so I'm dating myself, the then James Bond. I tell my parents James Bond goes to our church, and they said, no, that guy's a lawyer in the military. Okay. So they said from then on, I started saying, I want to be a lawyer, because I think I was thinking that's how you get to be James Bond. you become a lawyer and you do the Bond. So anyways, I went through law school. It wasn't, Joe, until I got to law school that it hit me that, wow, this is very different than what I was thinking a lawyer would be. The stuff that I was learning, I had no interest in. I really wanted to be like a business lawyer. And this was all, it's law school. So you do everything and anything in terms of your education. Right. I had no intention of quitting, but honestly, just I was going through it because I had committed to it and I wanted to get through law school successfully. But pretty much from day one, I was thinking, as soon as I get out of law school, I'm going to do an MBA and do what I really want to do. I did that, and I was pretty close, very close to going from my MBA to becoming an entrepreneur when a friend of mine said, you don't want to do that. Just take 1 year, because in Canada, I don't know whether you know this or not, if you go to law school, you can't just write the bar exam and be a lawyer. You have to apprentice for a year. They call it article.
I didn't know that. Okay. Because here you can take the bar, right? Yeah.
Exactly. So here I could have done it. Just go to law school, write the bar, and say, there, I'm a lawyer. Now I'm going to go to business. There, you're not allowed to say you're a lawyer. You can say I went to law school, but you can't say you're a lawyer. So my friend convinced me, sure, if I went all the way through law school, article, do the apprenticeship, then go into business. What happened was I did it. I did this apprenticeship. I was the least interested apprentice I think that existed for the first couple months. And then a switch flipped. I was in this big law firm in Calgary called Bennett Jones. It was one of the largest in Canada. And I realized this is the kind of lawyer I thought I wanted to be. This is actually interesting. This is business. They've got their hands in all the most interesting projects and companies in the country and even overseas. Ended up staying there as a lawyer and having a great practice in the energy industry, specifically power development. That was for I'd say 18 years, when it brought me to California for a client. And I landed at this amazing time. in the energy industry, and it turned out in tech too, which I had no exposure to ever.
Okay, interesting.
So that's, call it 2000, 2001. California energy is like blowing up. It's the California energy crisis, which, by the way, that's why my client wanted me there. I was working on fast track emergency power projects to try to save the grid.
Yeah.
At the same time, if you remember, Joe, the tech bubble is blowing up, and everybody's standing watching television sets and seeing the NASDAQ like just crater.
Yeah.
And for me, what happened was I got this like fast track indoctrination, education in tech, because that whole world was being completely disrupted, and it shook out people that probably shouldn't have been there, people that had easy success because everything that had .com on it was successful.
Yeah.
And you meet these, I'd say, more interesting people who are survivors of that and thrivers of that, where that really like launched them. And I got to know these people, and in a couple of years of working there and getting to know them, I decided the law is not for me. I want to be an entrepreneur. I want to take the tech and I want to take the energy and do clean tech. And then after that was kind of my career that followed of energy storage, batteries, thermal energy storage, more recently hydrogen, and kind of being where I feel we are now on the front lines of decarbonization, energy transition. Super, super grateful. You know, it was a winding road that took me here, but looking back, and that's a lot of years. This right now is, in my opinion, the most exciting and important time in my lifetime when it comes to energy. There's so much at stake. There's so much going on. There's so much urgency to it. I'm grateful that I'm here. Like, if I was talking to, from a perspective of a recruiter, I'd say, this is where you want to be. Like, what is more important and exciting than energy transition and what's happening in the energy space?
Yes. Yeah, I'm loving where you're going with that, because you're reminding me there's a gentleman I have coffee with once a month, and he's it's subjective. He's older than me, but he's kind of near the proverbial end of his career. But he has this saying, he's like, you've got to be more excited about tomorrow than you were of yesterday. Like, and I love his energy. And that's kind of what you just said right there, that I'm excited to hear, is that there's so much to do. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, again, especially kind of the younger generation, if you will, that you spend a lot of time, in the niche, and it took a while to get to some of the places that you got to. There is no overnight success, as some people like to label it. That doesn't really exist. So there's no silver bullet. But the fact that, you're still riding that wave, and you're at a point now where you've been in the niche a while and you've done very well for yourself, but at the same time, it's as exciting as it's ever been. That's really, really cool. Not everybody has that,
Yeah, but so I feel very blessed, as I think lots of, I'll say, older people do in our industry, that, if you're still engaged and you're still into this, it's amazing in terms of like the enthusiasm and the energy. It is kind of like being at the very beginning of your career, when there's so much that's uncertain and so much ahead. And that's, I think, that's the reality that we're in right now. So yeah, it's wonderful.
It's kind of what we're talking about a little bit off camera, where, the indispensable nature and component that energy is in our society today. It's something that cannot be ignored. It has to be addressed. We have demand issues that we're dealing with. We have interconnection issues that we're dealing with, an aging infrastruccer on the distribution transmission system. There's all kinds of things you can kind of grab at and go chase down and spend a lifetime doing it. And it's going to be a lot of fun, but that need is not going away. And I think that's the other exciting part too, is that impact we can have on solving a problem, and then in a way elevating and supporting the society with which we live. Not every job gets to do that.
No question. The reason I think there's such import to what we're doing is part of the energy puzzle is, I guess, touching on, going back to your point about the importance just of energy. I think no one disputes the fact that abundant, low-cost energy kind of determines a society. It determines your economy. You cannot have, there's no example of economy that doesn't depend on and kind of their success correlates to abundant
Yep.
low cost energy. That's been true like pretty much forever.
Yep.
The more recent challenge is the whole decarbonization challenge, the whole climate change, where it's not enough to just have abundant low cost fuel. You know, at a certain point, that can actually destroy you depending on its impacts. So you have to figure out how you fix two problems at the same time. One, you do need that abundant low cost energy, but you need to decarbonize it at the same time.
Right.
That to me, Joe, is like, that's the puzzle. Now, everybody doesn't have to work on everything. Everybody doesn't have to fix the whole thing, but those are the elements of it, which to me creates, great opportunity.
You know, I love the fact you kind of show the intersection of the two, and I think you're right. There is plenty to say grace over in this niche. I mean, there's so many components that you could I mean, you could become an SME in, and they're needed in all areas. What do you think is I mean, let's jump into that. As far as the low hanging fruit or the biggest thing that we need to tackle today, what does that look like to you? What's the big one we need to address sort of right now? I mean, we've hit on a couple of things. I know we're going to go in different directions here, but to kind of kick it off.
To me, like I'll say big, obvious needs / opportunities. I'd start with solar and wind, but I'll focus on solar has had a tremendous run. It's gone from very expensive, and I'll say complicated, to very inexpensive, very simple, like commoditized.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think a lot of people in the renewable industry, myself included, years ago thought of that as like, that's the total solution. You just like go with solar and it'll eventually just displace everything and you've got this perfect energy. Now, our actual experience has been we had great adoption until we started reaching the limits of the grid to accommodate solar.
Yes.
And you need energy storage. Right now I'm in Plus Power, and I think we're what I call front line of that challenge, which is our grid and every grid that has been aggressively adopting renewables needs energy storage as a matter of great urgency, or we're maxing out. I think the reality is in many parts of the country, we're kind of like hitting the natural limits of the grid as currently configured to productively take more solar and wind. And you're getting into places where you have significant curtailment of solar and wind, which, is, I think, obvious to everyone what a waste that is, how wrong that is. So how do you fix that? It's energy storage. That's a great, in my mind, this is a great example, though, Joe, of you can't just say, well, the solution is energy storage and just go all out on energy storage. Energy storage is a key part of that decarbonization, but it can't make energy scarce and costly. You need that abundant low cost energy. So you need cost effective energy storage. So I'm a fan of every innovation out there that actually has a good prospect of reducing the cost of batteries. In the case of Plus Power, we're not a battery maker. We don't invent batteries. We're agnostic. We want the lowest cost, reliable, efficient batteries out there, and we support their development. But what our real focus is, as I said, it's the front line where we are rolling out project after project in the hundreds of megawatts to allow the adoption of more renewable energy at the same time that we really do, target the worst polluting power generation out there. Most recently, we enabled the closure of the last coal-fired power plant in Hawaii by installing a large-scale, highly intelligent battery project that basically eliminated the need and allowed the retirement of that coal plant. We did it quickly, and I'd say we're kind of doing all the things that I think we should be doing, which is we don't need tens of megawatts. We need hundreds going to thousands. We need them going on parallel. We need lots of other people doing it. We need to get solar continuing its rapid adoption. That's one, I'd say, obvious thing that I think pretty much everybody in the industry would say No kidding. We need a lot more energy storage, and we got to keep driving down the cost of energy storage so that when we're done, we do have that abundant low cost energy. It's just not fossil fuel based. The other one, and it's reflected in my interest in hydrogen, Joe, is that I think that something that most people in the renewable energy industry have woken up to, myself included, I would say I was slow to come to this conclusion, is that when you look at the renewable energy adoption, and I'll say the success story, in one respect, it looks great. If you line it up against climate change, climate goals, it starts to look bad, like we're falling way behind where we actually have to get to. And if you look into that, I'd say the biggest reason why there's this huge gap between what we've achieved and what we need to achieve is almost all of the solar, wind, and battery work, which is good, has skipped over the most difficult to decarbonize parts of the economy, which are the most polluting parts. Like if you look at the most polluting parts of the economy, it's heavy industry and it's heavy transportation. Two biggest, most polluting. And then when you think about, well, how do you like decarbonize a cement plant with solar and wind and batteries? Well, you don't, because you can't generate what you need to in terms of heat and the industrial processes to do that. So there's cement, there's refineries, there's fertilizer facilities, trains, ships, heavy trucking. All these things that are the most polluting don't lend themselves to a battery and solar and wind to power the battery. They just don't. The batteries are at this stage, while they're great for grid projects, and they're perfectly okay for cars, bikes. You get to these big applications, don't work. You get to the industrial applications and they just don't apply, where you need these tremendous heat sources that you just can't do with electricity. That's where hydrogen comes in. And that's why I think as you've seen, I'm a big proponent of hydrogen. I am not a proponent of hydrogen as, well, that's the solution to everything. And it's something that I think you do see among some proponents of hydrogen is they point out the truth, which is you can actually use hydrogen for any energy need of any kind. You can. The question is, should you? No.
Ought you to do that? Yes, I agree. That's the other question.
So with hydrogen, my focus has always been, you can, don't. Like if you get into like using hydrogen for things that are actually perfectly good uses for solar, wind, batteries, that's like, to me, by definition, a dumb use of hydrogen, because hydrogen is not cost competitive with solar, wind, and batteries. Solar, wind, and batteries are much lower cost. Hydrogen is more expensive. So I'd say hold it back and use it where you can't use, you like physically can't use solar, wind, and batteries to decarbonize. And then take on those difficult to decarbonize. I think if as a country and as a world, we had that view of we have to take on the heavy polluters. We can't just keep skipping it over and saying, look how well we're doing with EVs and look how well we're doing with home solar. We have to look at the refineries. We have to look at the cement factories, the glass factory. Like we have to tackle those. And decarbonize them. There's a price to it, but I think if we're like focused, Joe, on the proper uses of hydrogen, it will be a cost-effective solution to those problems. And it's the only way I see us getting where we need to get to in terms of climate goals. Otherwise, I'm genuinely concerned that we do lots and lots of solar, wind, and batteries, and we fall further and further behind our goals. And this is not like a company goal setting thing. I'm a believer that we don't meet these goals. We are, you know what? It's not which I guess goes to my point about it's a very exciting time in our industry. It's also an exciting time in the scary sense that I never previously in my career was thinking, well, the projects I'm working on, these kind of projects, are needed to save the world. I never thought that. I always thought,
Yeah.
well, we need energy, so let's do this project, or we do this renewable project because it's a good thing to do. It's
Yeah.
better.
Yeah.
To me, that's this shift that's occurred late in my career, that this is not a nice to have. These aren't like good things to do. These are essential things to do, or we may see a dramatic and terrible deterioration on the planet, at least for humans.
Yeah. Well, gosh, that's it. Your point there is so well taken. You're not the first one to say that on this podcast, that we are at a critical juncture, and that if the situation doesn't get fixed, we will have some serious negative impacts to the world that we know and the society with which we have come to become comfortable living in. And I think for some people, maybe at arm's length, they hear that and maybe they think it's a bit sensationalized. But I think you talk to anybody who's certainly been behind the scenes, they can tell you that I think, to your point, it's just a real issue. It's just a real issue. I mean, you have the decarb stuff that we've talked about. You have what's your power supply look like, and are you meeting demand curves? And then it's the movement of power. Can you get it where it needs to go when you need it to get there? I mean, not having we say additional capacity on the lines is a real problem. I mean, a lot of the lines, certainly in California, I mean, they're stacked pretty deep, and CAISO does a pretty good job, but in some ways, I think they're overwhelmed, and it's tricky. There's so many pieces to the puzzle, and and that's the other part. You need cooperation, which can be easier said than done. And of course, anytime you want to wield power out of state, that's always really tricky. You want to move power across state lines, that becomes incredibly tricky if you're going to go across several states. Essential and critical are two good words, and I think they aptly apply to the fullest sense of their definition. But that's what makes it exciting, though. That's what makes the rides so fun right now. Is anybody in this space? I mean, we're playing for keeps here.
Yeah, you're highlighting something very important, Joe, that I wasn't bringing up, and that is, we have to deal with the reality as it is, and the reality as it is sometimes isn't very helpful to what we're trying to do. And the grid, you were talking about, like, interconnection, queues. The reality of the grid physically, as you know, is it was not built for what we're trying to do here. It was built in the days of fossil fuels. It was built around the idea of large scale central power plants. And that you totally controlled, and that behaved as you wanted them to do. And that was a good model for them. In a world where we don't really want that anymore for carbon reasons, and we want solar, wind, batteries, maybe hydrogen, that is a radically different world. There's parts of it that can be, based on that central model. But there's so much activity on the grid now, not on the transmission and distribution side, but on the generation side, which is distributed and is not controlled. And solar and wind, by definition, are not controlled. It's the sun, it's the wind. So that is when we talk about what we need to accomplish in the electricity industry, that is a real, like, anchoring, difficult reality that we're working with a grid across the country that wasn't built for this. And we're trying to, not replace it. Obviously, we're trying to adapt and make it work. Definitely a huge challenge, just from the utility perspective and the grid operator's perspective, which I haven't ever been, like, on their side. And I have a lot of respect for them trying to go from, say, utilities and grid operators that just pressed buttons and turned dials and everything did what it was supposed to. And it was, compared to what we're looking at today, relatively such a simple thing. To now, where these, uncontrolled loads and uncontrolled generation all over the place. And everybody wants the grid working. I think it is, I moved from California 4 years ago, and anyone living in California has seen, how, I'd say, unreliable the grid has become. Like, for a first world country, the grid in California has been plagued with problems, with outages far beyond what you would have seen historically.
Right.
partly due to renewables, but partly due to, I'd say, climate change, where you have wildfires and like things that just didn't happen before, to the
Yes.
extent that they're happening now and becoming part of life. That, yeah, it's a not an unusual event that the grid is taken down proactively due to
Hmm.
wildfires, and people are adapting to the fact, going back to the abundant low cost energy. Well, it's not so abundant when you can't have it at all for periods of time. And that's kind of part of your routine that
Yes.
would have been more of a third world reality, where
Yes.
people are
Yeah.
used to the idea of, oh yeah, the grid goes down routinely and you just adapt to that. That's not how you and I grew up.
It's interesting you say that too. I had a guest on the podcast here a little while back that argued a very similar trade, that when they were looking at, they've worked more with the RTOs and in the interconnections. And it's interesting because the comment that was made was, what we have traditionally historically looked at as times of year of concern, particularly the summer, is not always the case now. Really, we're more concerned about winter, and we're seeing events that don't happen when we expect them. And so, to your point, the mix and the variability, it has changed, and so the predictability has gone down. Your risk profile has increased, making what I think is a difficult situation even more difficult. And again, just to add to the complexity of the problems that we're trying to solve, it's a bit of kind of a hitting a moving target. It's not so easy. And I you resonate on that. Yeah, that's real.
I think that does tell you, though, that if you are young, if you are coming out of your education and going into the work
Mm-hmm.
world, or
Yeah.
if you're just early in your career,
Mm-hmm.
if energy appeals to you, one of the appeals that, or one of the reasons I think you should be all over that opportunity,
Yeah.
is I think experience counts for much less than it used to. If you think of
Mm-hmm.
our fossil fuel history,
Sure. Mm-hmm.
experience was so important. Like, you really needed to learn something deeply, and it didn't change much over time. Like the
Yep.
fossil fuel industry, the
Mm-hmm.
rate of change was extremely slow, and the rate of technology change was extremely slow, and market conditions changing were very slow. So
Mm-hmm.
it lent itself to, well, I'm a 30-year engineer, so I'm a lot more valuable than a 2-year engineer.
Right.
I've seen all these things, and I've seen them 100 times. I look at what you and I are just talking about now,
Mm-hmm.
and take hydrogen, for example. How many people will have 10 years experience in hydrogen?
Right.
Like, about none, myself
Exactly.
included. It is
Yeah.
a relatively, it used to be an industrial gas that nobody cared about, other than maybe, some heavy industry and space application.
Yeah.
Now you go to an energy conference and it's like the thing.
Yeah.
And the opportunity I think that creates for someone young is, you can get your head around hydrogen and be current in a couple of years. Like, and
Yeah.
you are not
Good
going to
point.
encounter a person who say, "Oh yeah, I've done 30 green hydrogen projects." There's
Yeah.
no such thing.
Yeah.
I'd say the same thing about, like, pick your area of energy, including electricity. Someone
Mm-hmm.
who had years and years of experience running a utility where they didn't have, deal with renewables. Well, okay, I'm sure that's experience, but how
Right.
much does that help them compared to the problems we're dealing with right now?
Sure.
Or even someone that was here, like in the early days of renewables. Back then, everybody was talking about, well, there's this, huge peak in the middle of the day when it's hot and sunny, and we've
Mm-hmm.
got to, like, reduce demand, or we've got to create more generation. Well, what
Exactly.
happened? Well, generation came along in the form of home solar, and all of a sudden, we don't have a giant peak in the middle of the day. We have the so-called bet curve. It's when people come home and the sun's going down. It's a
Yeah.
completely
The
different
depth.
condition.
Yeah.
And, what's the value of having had a lot of experience when we had a middle of the day peak? Because to me, if you look at the complication of the duck curve, that's almost like a completely different animal. So all this is to say that I think that, from I'd say, young person's perspective, looking at getting into the energy industry or in their early days in energy, you should realize the fact that you can become an expert. You can
Yeah.
get the necessary experience in an extraordinarily short period of time. To me, it's much more about your ability to be forward looking, to anticipate where things are going, as opposed to looking back when there's not much to look back on right now. We don't have a lot of history with what we're dealing with. It's new.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's gold, what you just laid down, honestly. And I can tell you, in the recruiting space, we see that a lot. As a matter of fact, I could speak to two quick examples. One, we have a client that does some battery storage, and they needed some people to support some work on site in California. And you're right. You're not going to find somebody with 15 years of best experience, industrial scale. They just don't exist. So if you're new in your career, or you've been seasoned perhaps even on the wind solar side, you can transition over. But there's a great opportunity, to your point, to put yourself in a position where you can become an SME, get some battery projects under your belt now, and then you'll really be at the forefront. And we've also supported a hydrogen startup. And again, same thing. I mean, to your point, there's not a lot out there. And so the people that we placed for that particular company, none of them had hydrogen experience. And so, but, one of them had some gasification experience, and another one had some good policy experience. But they saw, I think with these, the couple of people we put, they kind of saw what you said. Now, they were a little, I would say, further in their career, but they saw it. They saw the fact that there's something here. This is real. It's the forefront. It's exciting. Yes, I can get in early, but at the same time, it's super, super exciting. And it's interesting. One of the gentlemen that we did place actually made a trip to Japan for his company he was working for prior to coming on to the hydrogen startup we brought him to. And that was where I think he was also kind of slam dunked on hydrogen as well, looking at the hydrogen usage in Japan. And he was like, oh my gosh, we have a chance to do some of this in California. Oh man, I'm all in. I mean, Joe, I loved it when you kind of pitched it to me, but when I went and saw it, it's like, I'm all in. I got to talk to the CEO. We got to do this, baby. So I think great message and great advice. These are two niches that are ripe, and it won't take as long to become, super, super valuable. And then it puts you in a real demand position as an individual. I mean, it's a great opportunity, no doubt about it. Yep.
No question. And I'm sure your friend who went to Japan, that would be an eye opener, because that, when I was saying don't use hydrogen for everything just because you can, that's probably one of the only examples in the world where that's kind of the direction they're going. It's a hydrogen economy. I guess the logic is they don't really have any homegrown energy. So that's maybe that is the way to go. But they do amazing things there when it comes to innovation.
They do. They really do. I want to jump back to talking about the best projects and, being able to take the coal offline and have the battery storage. When you're looking at and evaluating projects on the best side, I guess I'm curious, as you look at solar, wind, or even a gas plant you could pair up a BESS to, what kind of a ratio are you really looking for in terms of how much battery would we want per generation of megawatts, solar, wind, gas? And then the other question I have, maybe as a piggyback, and probably will be in your answer, is what size batteries are you looking for? 1, 2, 4-hour discharges? How many megawatts? What's the sweet spot? And where do you think it's going? Because you may come back and say, hey, look, this is what we're doing now, but I think this is where we're going to go with it. Because there's always that transition. So I'm kind of curious, a little bit of predictive insight too.
Sure. So I guess I'd start with the notion of ratio. It is so totally dependent, Joe, on the specific grid problem that we're trying to solve. So I would say something that distinguishes Plus Power from just many other battery storage developers who are looking for this much battery paired with this much solar. This is the sort of the right ratio. And they're basically trying to mimic a power plant, fossil fuel power plant by combining the batteries and the solar.
Right.
We as a company don't explicitly pair our battery project with generation or pair. What we're doing is we're scanning the entire grid for, I'll characterize them very broadly as grid problems, but to be specific, we're watching what's coming online, obviously what exists, what's coming online, what's getting retired, and predicting where you're going to have grid problems being congestion, lack of generation, too much generation,
Okay.
need for transmission that is very, very high cost, very long term, and look where a battery sized correctly with the right functionality can solve that problem and solve it cheaper, faster than any other solution.
Interesting.
That could be very simple, like there are irregular shortages of power. You need like a 1 hour battery. You need like 100 megawatts.
Sure.
And all it's doing is just filling in for these gaps when you know they're going to occur. That would be a simple function.
Okay.
Extreme opposite would be our Hawaii project, which is a 4 hour battery.
4 hour.
I believe it to be like the most complicated battery project in the world, in the sense that it performs the most services of any battery. So it's not just there like to arbitrage the market.
Right.
Like in ERCOT, where you're sitting there and you're waiting for the right price signal, and then you jump, and then while you're down, you recharge. It's not that. It is literally configured and designed for Hawaii Electric, who's both the utility and basically the grid operator. Since it's
HECO.
HECO. To have all the attributes of a power plant, but it's a battery. So it's using up as its, it needs electricity, so it's not really a generator, but it is operated by HECO to charge only when there's a surplus of solar, which is a regular event for them. And then it is used to provide various grid services, ancillary services, or power when needed, just generally. So for us, it's hard to find projects that look similar because each one is designed for a specific thing. Oh, I would say, we have several operating assets in ERCOT. And yes, those look quite similar because they have a simple function. Be there when electricity is short and supply it, and you follow those price signals. I do think that when you're saying, what do we do now and what will we do? Historically, it's been, it started off being 1 hour batteries. That's what we were building. And then it's moved up to 2, then to 4. And I think the reason for that trend is as you get more and more solar, which we touched on that before, you get a need for longer and longer duration storage. And where that goes, don't know, other than my prediction would be over time, you will see a demand for 6 hour storage, 8 hour storage. Over time, you will see that the limits of lithium ion batteries get tested because they're awesome for one. I'd say they're great for 4 hour storage. Like you're still well within their sweet spot in terms of cycles, degradation, lifespan. As you get longer, barring some radical improvement in lithium ion storage technology, those batteries no longer become the right tool for the solution. And as I mentioned earlier, Joe, Plus Power, we're not a battery maker. We're not there to promote lithium ion. We're there to use batteries of whatever chemical or technology that is the most appropriate for the problem at hand. So I could certainly, looking into the future, see that we as Plus Power may get into different chemistries, different types of batteries. Hydrogen, green hydrogen, I'd say, is like probably the ultimate in long duration storage. But that application, in my opinion, is not a good one today. Because while, yes, green hydrogen could give you, 30-day storage, nobody actually wants that, right? Like, we don't need that right now. I think we're evolving. My prediction is, yes, we will need longer and longer duration storage. Therefore, people will pay for it. There will be a market. But if you were out there yourself, Joe, trying to pitch people on 12-hour storage projects, I think the market would tell you, I don't need that. I'm not there.
Especially at a premium. Yeah, they wouldn't pay it.
Yes, and I'd
I
say
mean, not today. Yeah.
not today. And generally speaking, all longer duration storage projects cost more than shorter duration. So there just isn't a market for them. So I think it's like an interesting
Yeah.
technology resource for the future. I think we'll need it.
Okay.
We just don't need it now.
No, I appreciate you throwing that out there. That was one of the questions you answered that I had was sort of the limiting functionalities of the technology. And you mentioned lithium ion, and it has a sweet spot, but at some point, its sweet spot will be overrun, and it's no longer the right application for the solution to that particular problem. So you got to pivot away from it. I mean, I like the fact you guys are pretty battery agnostic. That's great because it gives you the freedom to look. It gives you the freedom to what would you say? I mean, have those conversations, where there's a detachedness there, which I think is healthy for the marketplace. You're willing to talk to different suppliers. What have you got? What's the idea? What's it doing? How the prototype's testing up? And then, where could we potentially put that in our portfolio of projects as you're evaluating, your development, on an ongoing basis? I think it's really, really exciting. The long term, yeah, I mean, I could see that happening too. Do you also see in terms of batteries themselves going a longer duration? Do you see bigger battery, we'll call them farms at the, will you see the size increase too, the footprints increase? Is that just part of the natural progression at the same time? Because you run them in series, run them in parallel, but you would need more anyway, potentially.
You can. So I think that as a matter of fact,
Mm-hmm.
our projects have increased in size.
Okay.
But not really so much because we need longer duration. So we're not just saying, well, we'll just add more batteries to give you a longer duration. It's more that we just need we have some larger scale problems that need a lot more power. So we are building larger projects, but it's not necessarily driving up the hours. I think that
it's the power. The power is the nugget you're chipping at on that one, right?
That's correct. And I'd say that's what's like driving bigger and bigger projects.
Okay.
Although it is true what I said that, yeah, we started at 1 hour and now it's more like 4 hours is the normal. Okay. But I think all of that is fine when it comes to batteries. It's more, as I said, as you're getting above 4, certainly as you're getting into 8 and beyond, sure, you could just like add more batteries and you could deal with that, but that's not likely the cost-effective way to do it. That's when you start looking at different storage technologies. Right. But again, kind of an academic subject, in my opinion, not because it's not going to happen, but because it's not today. Right. There isn't really the market for it. But yeah, if you looked at one of our early projects, it would look relatively small. The footprint would look small because it was like 50 megawatts, and yeah, they're growing in scale as they should, because some of our projects, as I mentioned, well, the Hawaii project, it's replacing a coal power plant. So that's a lot of power. So you need, a big project.
Yeah. How many megawatts on that? I'm out of curiosity.
It's 185 megawatts.
185 megawatts. That's good size. That's good size. Wow. Yeah. Wow.
But then we've got a project in Texas called Rodeo Ranch, which is 330 megawatts.
330. Wow, look at that. Almost doubled, right? I mean, wow. That's it's amazing. I mean, again, kicking back to where we talked just a few minutes ago. I mean, the niche is exploding. I mean, to your point, get in now because you'll do a 330 and then it'll be a 500, and you can talk about the good old days at 330 when those were the small projects. I mean, it's funny when you're later in your career, we can talk about stuff. Remember the solar field that was 10 megawatts? It was huge. I mean, do you remember those days? God, it was ginormous. And you're yeah.
I do. Well, like just, in the space of battery storage, the definitive, I'd say, change in the market for battery storage occurred in California. And it was the Energy Storage Act in 2013. Mm-hmm. At the time, and I was in energy storage, people were doing like 2 megawatt battery projects. Mm-hmm. Obviously, like pilots, right? That's what they were. Right. But that was literally what was happening at that time in 2013 when California said, we're not going to get where we need to get to unless utilities get serious about energy storage. So they did this under the Energy Storage Act, this historic procurement. It was 1,300 megawatts of storage. And it was in all the headlines, Joe. It shook up the whole industry. there were editorials saying that's insane. How could you possibly have 1,300 megawatts of storage? And
That's
my
great.
company at the time, Ice Energy, we got 25 megawatts, and we were literally, it made the company. It changed the whole world for us. We interviewed by The Economist, Time, and everyone's talking about 25 megawatts, like it's never happened before. And like, what are we talking about? That's 11 years ago.
11 years ago. Yes.
And today, 300, 200, like you throw on these numbers like that's just normal.
Yes.
Well, 11 years ago, that would have been fantasy, just total fantasy.
Sure.
So, which is good, by the way, because we need this. And to go back to the beginning of our conversation, not only do we need this, we need way more of this, like way more.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, it's going to beg a heck of a podcast when we talk again in 11 years and we go back and we cite this one for reference. Like, remember when? Man, what are they doing? So, oh, that's great. One of the things, let's pivot too. I want to talk a little bit about hydrogen. I want to kind of get your thoughts on hydrogen, what we're seeing in the market today, the blue, the green hydrogen. And I think you're right. I think when it comes to, shipping a lot of the marine applications, of course, the heavy trucking industry, cars, there's amazing opportunities to clean some of this stuff up. So what do you see, kind of the same thing? What do you think is the big target that's needs to be sort of addressed today? And then kind of looking forward, what would we expect, kind of changes do we think we may want to see or expect?
Yeah, hydrogen is very interesting because to a very large degree, we're dealing with a blank slate. There's so little that exists in the hydrogen space today at any real scale that it's kind of the opposite of we were talking about electricity and the grid and what we have to do. Like we're talking about what we're going to do with the stuff that exists. Well, hydrogen, we don't have that issue. So we have to think about what is it we want to do. So I break it up into three parts. There's what uses are there? And I think we've already touched on that, okay, sure, you can use it for everything. And you see stories about this, that people make a hydrogen scooter and a hydrogen bike and a hydrogen heater for the home. Okay, these are all things that, yes, you can do anything. And people are, unfortunately, in my opinion, doing a whole lot of that stuff. But as we discussed before, Joe, I think what you really should be doing if we're going to be serious about this is focusing on where hydrogen is the only solution. It's the only technical viable solution.
I like that. Yeah.
And get those, I'd say, big polluters, heavy transportation, heavy industry, to embrace it. I'm not saying mandate it or force them, but I'm saying that's what the hydrogen industry should be targeting. Those are your customers. If you want to produce hydrogen, you want to move hydrogen, those are your customers. They're the ones that can actually benefit from it. That's the consumption side. The opposite side is the production. I'm an advocate of all clean hydrogen. Obviously not an advocate of conventional hydrogen. It's one of the worst polluting types of energy there is. But any version of clean, by the standard of the Department of Energy, which includes all the different colors, turquoise, blue, green, gold, white, every one of them can meet the standard of the DOE as to what's clean hydrogen, and therefore is good in that sense. To me, it's more about, obviously, the economics. What's the lowest cost way of doing it, all things considered, and what's the practical way of doing it? Because I think it really depends on what kind of hydrogen is economic and feasible for what use. If you're saying, I want hydrogen in this location, and you're 1,000 miles away from natural gas, okay, you're not realistic making blue hydrogen or turquoise hydrogen. You don't have natural gas, and under current technology, you're not moving it 1,000 miles. So that's not going to be the economic way to do it. So that drives you to more likely versions of green hydrogen, where it's probably smaller scale, it's distributed, and that's a limiting factor because it needs solar, probably batteries, needs land, but you can do it pretty much anywhere. As long as you have land, you can do it. You need water as well.
Right.
That's the production side. So just I'd say, look, we're going to need a lot of hydrogen, but it's got to be low cost and it's got to be the appropriate kind for the use. So
Okay.
I would advocate, don't get hung up on colors. Don't say blue is bad, green is good. I've seen, blue hydrogen projects that are extraordinarily low carbon, incredibly low carbon. I've
Okay.
seen so-called green hydrogen projects that are solar powering an electrolyzer, which is also connected to the grid and runs off the grid whenever the solar isn't going,
Oh,
and are
interesting. Yeah.
incredibly carbon intense, like way, just bad, really.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
yet called green because it's an electrolyzer and there is solar connected to it. So
Yes.
I'd
Yeah. Yeah.
say I'd be an advocate of be open-minded, be objective, look at the carbon intensity of what you're doing as
Right.
to the type of hydrogen, but also look at the practicality. Like, what can you realistically do? The
Right.
most difficult, Joe, is the last one, which is the in-between. The most difficult part about hydrogen, which I'm not really involved in,
Sure.
thankfully. I don't think I'm suited to it. It is the most difficult, and that is, how do you get hydrogen from where it's produced to where it's used?
Yeah.
There will be some times where there is no distance.
Yes.
And that's great. If you can produce it right where you consume it, you don't have that
Oh,
problem.
ideal. Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm going to say, in most cases, there's going to be some material, not 1,000 miles, but some material requirement to move hydrogen over distance from
Yes.
where it's produced to where it's consumed. And that's where, like, from an engineering perspective and a technology perspective, you have the most challenging parts, in my opinion, of hydrogen. I look at the use and the production as mostly, it's fun, it's exciting, there's new ideas, everything's
Yeah.
getting better. You look at the middle part and, it's you need a large space unless you compress it under extreme circumstances to the point of cryogenic. You have the issue of leakages. You have embrittlement with pipelines when you use hydrogen. Like, that's where, in my opinion, like, all the nasty, difficult problems with hydrogen live, in the connective space between
Right.
production and consumption. So, I'm hoping those are where the really brilliant minds go and
Yeah.
they figure out. And I certainly believe it will be figured out, but it's not an area I've worked in. It's an area I've more worked around, and you kind of have to make assumptions about what will
Sure.
be there when it's actually needed. Because right now, nothing's there that's needed unless you're just thinking, I'm going to put it in a truck, cryogenically store it, and move it, and it's got a gigantic price tag for doing that.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and I think that's why the projects that I've kind of been around on the green side, the siting is so important. The location of where you're
Yeah.
going to is like, I mean, it's always important in any kind of project development, but I would say with hydrogen, it is really, really critical because you're in some ways immobile and you have to operate under that assumption unless well, the economics, you really articulated very well, the economics going to massively change. And a project that'll pencil will no longer pencil. And so you're kind of back to square one again. So the site where you're producing and consuming, from what I've seen, it's just a huge part of the equation to make the project work. So that's what do you think? I talked to someone else on a podcast, and I want to get your take on this too. So when it comes to getting the heavy industry, we can look at the heavy industry, we can look at the marine, we could look at heavy trucking, right? Could go maybe three separate groups. How do you get them to embrace, this idea of hydrogen? How do you move and shift someone's mindset at an individual level, but also at a corporate level, that this is a place that we need to go? Maybe this is bigger than us. How does that conversation get started? And in your thoughts, looking at the business and potentially legal side of it, how does one begin to or incentivize to kind of move in that direction? And I like the fact you kind of mentioned no mandate. So it's something that hopefully is more of an organic shift. The right thing for the right reason usually brings right results. How does that happen? How do you get that adoption? How do we move that along a bit?
There's two things that come to mind
Sure.
that I've actually been working on. One
Okay.
is the cost. Like, the cost has to be front of mind when we're talking about production.
Yeah.
And that's why you have to be open to all kinds of clean hydrogen, is that if you are going to get wide scale adoption in the difficult to decarbonize sectors, heavy industry, heavy transportation,
Yes.
which generally speaking aren't like consumer brands,
That's right.
generally speaking, less sensitive to what the public thinks.
Absolutely. Good way to put it. Yep.
Yes, just as a starting point,
Yeah.
you have to be coming to the table with hydrogen that has a cost that doesn't shock them and turn them off out of the gate. Like you have got to, you have to have a pathway to hydrogen being, yes, having a premium to fossil fuels, but one that they can kind of get their head around.
Okay, it's palatable.
So,
all right.
Palatable, yes.
Yeah.
So we cannot be talking about, 5 megawatt electrolyzers producing hydrogen at $15 a kilo. Like that's not going to work.
Right.
So that's one side. I think the other side of it is what I have done in my work in hydrogen, and I think it's the only practical way to go, is to, among those industries and those companies that are in this difficult to decarbonize, heavy polluting space, is you want to target the ones that you think have some sensitivity to the public, are open to the idea that this could be advantageous to them. One example I would say would be airlines. There is a real market opportunity, hydrogen for airlines. Both short haul routes, probably that's the best, but over time could be intermediate routes where you're replacing, regional jets, you're using hydrogen instead of electricity. It's probably more practical, realistic, it's cost competitive. And I think those are both serious polluters.
Yes.
But people that obviously have a sensitivity to their public image.
Absolutely.
And for a long time, they've been just, I think, to be blunt, kind of greenwashing with talk about sustainable aviation fuels when they aren't actually doing any of that. And that practically is not going to be any kind of other than Band-Aid solution, very small scale. But the fact that they promote that and talk about that and want to be green, to me, they're high on the list of, I would target those companies to make the case that hydrogen is a pathway that they should embrace. It's going to be popular among consumers, and you actually care about consumers. Fertilizer, I wouldn't normally say, oh, well, they're super sensitive to the public. But interestingly, I'd say I have seen firsthand that fertilizer producers, ammonia fertilizer producers, selling to farmers, and farmers thinking of this as that they do have a sensitivity for green, and they may be incentivized by certain government incentives to go with low carbon fertilizer rather than high carbon. So I guess it's a case, Joe, I think, pick your spots and don't just randomly say, well, these big polluters, they got to buy my hydrogen because they're so polluting and they'll benefit from it. They got to clean up their act. I think you got to be focused on what's the benefit of doing it. Of course, decarbonizing is a benefit, but how will that make your customers happy? Is that going to make your customers happier? Are they going to appreciate the fact that you're making this effort to decarbonize? Then I think you've got a conversation. If you show them, I can make this pretty economic, and I can show you how your customers are going to reward you if you go down this path. You don't need to get into the fact that, there may come a time, depending on how things go in this country, where there are mandates. I guess I'm thinking if we get worse and worse climate issues, increasingly the spotlight will turn to the worst polluters, and you may get into government action. But I wouldn't go there. I'd go on, kind of goes back to the beginning where, I think you work with what you've got today. And I think that's a market today. I think I've had those conversations with those kinds of customers, and I think there's a pathway there. There's others I won't get into where, there's no conversation to have at this time, maybe later, but you're looking for who among all those really, tough, hard to decarbonize industries is seriously open to changing.
Wow, I absolutely love your take on that. I really do. The sensitivity really stands out. It's interesting. I had another guy on a podcast. We were talking about, industrial heat was the application for their clean tech, and we talked about heat being in a process. It's kind of responsible for everything. Look around your room; it all required heat in some way, shape, or form to probably make it. And it's interesting because we were having kind of a similar conversation about market adoption and certainly what their ideal client would look like, and why. And it was at that moment I was drinking out of a bottled water, and it happened to be one that I don't normally buy. I was at a store and grabbed it. It was from Hawaii or something. And I can't tell you how much of the back part of that bottle of water went to explaining their social responsibility, carbon neutral, where it came from, how it's being taken. Basically, this is the cleanest water you're ever going to drink. That's the best for the planet. I mean, you are a superstar for buying this. Like, you should pat yourself on the back for buying our product today. I mean, it just made you feel good. And so I think you hinted to that, and that's the retail side where you're highly sensitive to customer interactions, and customer response. But I think you really hit something there. I think is really key. Also, you could get, if you're early adopter, you can kind of have that first mover position, where if you were the airline that went first, you can promote that for the next 50 years. We were the guys that were, like the original chicken sandwich, right? We're the guys.
Which is very much, you're right. To me, that is a key part of the pitch, that
Yes.
there's an opportunity, but it's probably only for the first one.
That's right. No, it's the first and only first. But there again, an incentive as to why this may be in your best interest. So, no, great answer. I love it. Not one I would have thought of on my own. So I'm glad we had you here to answer it. I know we're getting ready to wind down. I have another question I want to chuck at you that I kind of like, and you can go from a business perspective or even a personal perspective. But what is one of the best pieces of advice you've ever received?
Best piece of advice I've ever received.
Yeah, that you think has really been a guiding light, a North Star, through your career, through your life, that perhaps you hearken back to on occasion, and it kind of brings you back to center. Or if you're feeling a little doubt, it shores you up a little bit. I mean, it can be anything. I'm always kind of curious, what are some of those, what would you say, core components of individuals, that keep them going?
I have been blessed, Joe, by having had several great mentors in my life.
Yeah.
Both like publicly known and not publicly known,
Sure.
that have helped me tremendously and given me great advice. I can think of one that kind of jumps to mind as a person that would be well known, General Norman Schwarzkopf. I had the benefit of working for him, with him in an early startup of mine.
Oh, wow.
And I learned a lot from him, as you might imagine. But the best advice he gave me, he gave it to me in very harsh terms. It was a version of, you have to do the right thing in all circumstances without regard to the consequences to yourself.
Wow.
And
wow.
I can tell you that has served me so well. It oftentimes feels really bad in the moment.
Yeah.
But it has always been absolutely the right thing, where I've done something that I knew was the right thing. I believed in the moment it was bad for me personally.
Right.
And it never turned out to be the case. It always turned out to be good for me personally.
Interesting.
So, and before that, I would say that was not like my mindset. I was one of those people that think, okay, well, I know I should do this, but it's obviously seems bad for me. So I don't really want to do that. Maybe I'll do a version of it so it's not so bad.
Of course. Yeah.
And this discipline of just no, you know what's the right thing. If you consciously take yourself out of the equation, it's very easy. If you do that, it's very easy to know what's the right thing and do it, and just accept that the consequences to you will be the consequences to you, but you'll know you did the right thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's one. Another one that I won't attribute to someone, but it's a version of make no small plans, which I've really tried to follow in my career in energy is
Yeah.
you want to go after a big, audacious goal. Don't be afraid of it. You won't regret it. And even if you fall short of that big, audacious goal, you
Uh-huh.
probably will have accomplished more and done
Yeah.
more important things that if you were timid and set a much smaller, what you believe to be
Yes.
more manageable goal and even achieved it,
All right. Right.
your regret for having not reached further will live with you.
Yeah. Great advice. Oh, I think that's so true. You shoot for the stars, and oftentimes you land way, way further than you would if you played it safe
Yep.
and gone small. So, wow, two pieces of that's great advice. I love it. That was solid. That is really good stuff. I don't care where you are in your career. That applies across the board. Um,
I believe so. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's great stuff. I always like to leave the last kind of comment for the guest. Is there? I love this conversation today. I think we got into a lot of good stuff. This was super super fun. I've enjoyed it. We got to do it again. But rounding out today, what any other final thoughts? Anything that's come to your mind that you kind of want to share or talk about that as a way to send us out? I always like to kind of leave that for you.
I think, Joe, we've kind of covered the landscape already, and I really enjoyed it. So no, I don't have
Thank you.
any bomb to drop at the end. I've
Okay.
enjoyed speaking with you. You're a very natural interviewer, very easy to speak with, and
Thank you.
yeah, I enjoyed the discussion very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Well, I appreciate you coming on today, Mike. It's certainly been my pleasure to host you. And again, if you're watching the podcast, you want to come on the show right there behind me, intergeniuspodcast.com. Check it out. You can find us on YouTube and on LinkedIn. And the question is this, really, it's up to you to discover it, to harness it, and to share it with the world. There's a genius inside of you, and it's up to you to let us know what it is. Again, Mike, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really enjoyed my time with you.
Likewise.
This is the Padua Podcast Network. PaduaPodcastNetwork.com.